Good morning and welcome to What Went Wrong in Afghanistan. My name is Jan Wallman and I'm pleased to see so many in the classroom. Oh, I'm sorry. That's okay.
Yes. Very good. Live again. Welcome to What Went Wrong in Afghanistan. Welcome to all of you in the classroom and thank you for joining us on Zoom. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Joel Pompen. He is an associate professor in political science at Hope since 1997. He has a BA from Hope, a master's and a PhD from Purdue, and his study of the field of study was political science and international relations. He currently teaches at Hope U.S. foreign policy, global political economy, and global politics. Please note that his bio reads, Joel's innovative, experiential, and interdisciplinary courses have included, please note those words. So we look forward to an interesting presentation. Anyway, he's been offered 8 terms of Hope off-campus program, 2 in Japan, 2 in Rwanda, and 4 in DC. He's created internships in South Africa and Tanzania. His research interests include US foreign policy, food insecurity and ag development, and global political economy. His research has taken him to many countries in South Africa, and he has been honored by students as an outstanding professor. So we look forward to this presentation this morning. And yes, he is Mary Toppin's son. And his father, Philip, was an admissions officer here at Hope for a number of years. Fun fact, while visiting ballparks with his son, he played wiffle ball on the diamond of the old Tiger Stadium. So with all of that background, we welcome Joel.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jan, for inviting me. I was upstairs in the old room a bit ago and wondering, not much of a turnout today. So I'm glad I got in the right spot, and it's a pleasure to be here and be speaking with you all. Like most of you, I can take my mask off. That's okay? Yeah. Okay, all right. Thank you. Microphone. Okay, so like many of you, I suspect I'm a bit distracted this morning with the events in Ukraine. I was up fairly late last night watching the news and the sad news. So as a student of U.S. foreign policy, this is an important moment. So we're going to focus on Afghanistan. Is this on still? Okay, good. And so yeah, as Jan had mentioned, my area of emphasis is U.S. foreign policy. I teach U.S. foreign policy here at the college. My dissertation at Purdue was in U.S. foreign policy. And so I am not an expert of Afghanistan or of Central Asia, or my area of training and focus is on U.S. foreign policy. So when I'm saying what went wrong in Afghanistan, I'm coming from a U.S. perspective, what went wrong in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and not necessarily as an expert of Afghanistan politics, and not necessarily coming from that perspective. So what went wrong in Afghanistan? Everything. Any questions? It's a short lecture today. So yes, I mean, I'm using some humor there, but it's a sad and troubling and difficult topic, especially when we look at what's happening currently in Afghanistan. The news is not good. There are tens of millions of people who are facing food insecurity and life-threatening food insecurity. And recent estimates from the United Nations are some 8 million people who are at risk of famine. And the population of Afghanistan is a bit under 40 million. So most of the population is facing food insecurity. And it's a dire situation. And so going back, though, I want to provide a little bit of a background, not too much history, but some history I think is important. In 1978, there is a change of government in Afghanistan, and a communist-leaning government takes power in Afghanistan. And of course, this is during the height of the Cold War. So the Soviet Union and the United States are competing through proxies around the world. One supporting one side, another supporting another side. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up the communist-leaning government in Afghanistan. The United States then begins to be involved to object, to support the rebels, who were a big part of whom were the Mujahideen, the holy warriors that were resisting, in this case, the evil empire, the great superpower of the Soviet Union. And among the Mujahideen included Osama bin Laden. So as they say in politics, often, politics makes for strange bedfellows, and certainly during the 80s. In 1988, the Soviet Union, facing severe economic problems domestically, internally, the economy is crumbling, Soviet Union is in dire straits, so they decide to withdraw from Afghanistan in 1988 under Mikhail Gorbachev. And so from the United States perspective, when this occurs in the late 80s, then the US, to a certain extent, kind of wipes its hands of Afghanistan, saying, essentially, our concern, our issue, our interest is gone, because the objective from the US perspective was to push back against the Soviet Union and its attempt to create pro-Soviet governments in Afghanistan, but also around the world. So when the Soviets pull out in the late 80s, then the US, like I said, seems to kind of wash our hands of it and say, okay, yes, Afghanistan has severe problems, civil war, poverty, but essentially from the US perspective, not our problem. And so then, of course, on September 12, probably, for most Americans, September 12, 2001, we realized, oh, yes, this is our problem in Afghanistan. So with the attacks, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and just to make sure that we're clear, right, the terrorist attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda, international, transnational terrorist organization. They were sponsored, they were hosted, they were supported by the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban. The Taliban had taken power in 1996. They had essentially won the civil war in Afghanistan and had ruled for about 5 years. And in that interim had welcomed Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization, to operate within Afghanistan. Ideologically, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were on the same page. And even though the Taliban mostly are homegrown Afghans, Pashtuns wanting to rule Afghanistan. The Al-Qaeda organization is a global transnational terrorist organization that they want to attack the US. They want to have a global effort. But the two were ideologically compatible. So the United States decides after the attacks of 9/11 to not just go after the terrorists, but to in fact go after states, countries, nation states that support terrorism. And of course, the Taliban government in Afghanistan was a essential supporter of Al-Qaeda. So this is an important decision, and it was made on the day of 9/11 of 2001. And the decision is two decisions that work together that led to this 20-year failure of the United States in Afghanistan. Two decisions on the day and the evening of 9/11, the attacks. The first decision was to say that the attacks of 9/11 were not a crime. Of course, they were criminal, but in fact were an act of war. That this previous terrorist attacks were treated as criminal behavior. The FBI might get involved. People had killed innocent people. This is a criminal act, an attack, and so we're going to go after the criminals, bring them to justice. George W. Bush and his national security team made the decision in 9/11 that no, we're not going to treat this as a criminal case. This is not a crime that we're going to send in law enforcement. We're going to apprehend the criminals and we're going to bring them to justice. No, in fact, this is an act of war. And so the US is put immediately on a war footing. And the second important decision that is made on that day is that the United States will make no distinction between the terrorists and the states, the governments, the countries that supported that terrorism. So this is interesting. It's fascinating. In the United States, the U.S. had been attacked before. Of course, we remember. We think of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack of Pearl Harbor. In my U.S. foreign policy class, we talked quite a bit about how the Japanese also attacked the Philippines, which at the time was just as much a part of the United States as was Hawaii. But as we talk about the events of that day, we just refer to it as Pearl Harbor. And we kind of just erase or forget about the attacks of the Philippines, which was a US colony at the time. But so in that case, it's a nation state attacking a nation state. And for scholars of international relations, we're used to dealing with these sorts of interactions: state versus state, country versus country, nation state versus nation state, the Japan, Germany, Italy versus the United States. And previous wars in the United States have been between nation states. And so in this case, the United States is attacked by a non-state actor. Not a country, not a nation state, but a non-state actor, a terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, attacks the United States. And so it's interesting, and perhaps part of the problem is that the United States decides, okay, we've been attacked by a non-state actor, let's go after nation states, right? Because we know how to do that. We know where they live. We know where they are. We're accustomed to going to war versus nation states. So the United States made that important decision, of course, going into Afghanistan shortly after the attacks in 2001, and then, of course, going into Iraq in 2003. And why this is important is because the war on terror then becomes a nation building exercise, or more accurately, a state building exercise. So sometimes we use these words interchangeably, nation or nation state, but a nation is more of a people group, a cultural organization or identity, and the state is more the government. the ruling institutions, the power of the government. And so we say nation building, but we're not trying to build a national identity of Afghans. It's actually a state building exercise. And in fact, supposedly a democracy building exercise, which is distinct from an anti-terrorism campaign or going after the bad guys of Al-Qaeda, but trying to prop up a new government. Colin Powell had, for years before the war on terror begins, had talked about the so-called Pottery Barn rule. And the Pottery Barn rule is you break it, you bought it. So the United States going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, breaks the government, takes the government down, removes the Taliban, in the Iraqi case, removes Saddam Hussein for power. So we broke it. And then we bought it. So, okay, that was the easy part, taking out the Taliban. Now comes the difficult part, which is trying to build up a state government apparatus in Afghanistan, particularly the government itself, and also, of course, the armed forces, trying to build an Afghan armed forces that would be able to protect itself against the Taliban, and eventually the United States would then be able to withdraw. And so this highlights, though, a key strategic problem from my perspective, and that is that the goal of the United States is the same as the goal of the enemy. The Taliban, what did the Taliban want? They wanted the US to leave. What did the US want? Presumably to leave. We want to build this country up, build up the state, build up an army, build up a government, and then be able to go, okay, we're out. It's not, you got it now. So the idea was that the strategic problem is we want to leave, that's our goal. And the Taliban's goal is they want us to leave as well. So you may have heard the expression, it's been widely used in regards to Afghanistan, that the United States had all the clocks. The Taliban had all the time. So we had the fancy machines, we had the smart bombs, the laser guided missiles, all the clocks, all the technological prowess, tools, fancy stuff. And the Taliban had the time. And so the strategy then was to wait us out. It took 20 years, but they in fact prevailed in that strategy. A couple of big points that I want to focus on, kind of big takeaways, I guess. One is, I think that, in terms of lessons that we draw from the US war in Afghanistan, is that we see the limits of military power, or the limits of hard power. In political science, we make a distinction between hard power, military power, guns, tanks, bombs, troops, right? And then soft, so-called soft power, which has to do with diplomacy and making a good impression on countries, wanting countries or actors around the world to emulate the United States, to want to support the United States. And so all the forms of power that wouldn't be hard power are going to that soft power category. So the military power is what we usually call hard power. And so we're seeing the lesson of Afghanistan is the limits of military power. And in the US case, the limits of super military power. The United States military is the biggest, baddest military force that humanity has ever seen. We spend roughly $800 billion each year on military defense. Some critics would say on military offense, right? But a huge figure, far greater than any other country in the world. And also with the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, the budget for financing those wars wasn't out of the normal military budget. So military spending during those years, there was the budget for the wars, and then there was the regular military budget. So it was, in fact, spending during those times was over $1 trillion dollars, or excuse me, over nearly $1 trillion of military spending a year. And we're fighting the Taliban, some of whom live in caves during that time, some of whom were on horseback. Right. So scholars of international relations refer to this situation as asymmetric conflict. On the one hand, you have a huge superpower, the superpower in human history. And on the other side, you have, the opposite of that. And so if you were looking, at it on paper, you would say, oh, this is not even a fair fight. Of course, that the superpower would prevail in such a situation. So the question becomes, how is it that big countries lose small wars? And scholars look at this case of asymmetric conflict. So the Afghanistan war is a classic case of asymmetric conflict, where a big superpower, the superpower, is unable to prevail in a conflict that on paper you would think would be kind of a slam dunk, would be pretty easy to defeat an organization like the Taliban. And so we could go back to Vietnam. There are, of course, many parallels with the Vietnam War, important differences and distinctions, of course, but another case where the superpower was unable to prevail. So the limits of hard power, I think, is a major takeaway from the Afghanistan war. Also, it's interesting to me, and I think important, that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the end of the US war in Afghanistan, was bipartisan, largely bipartisan. Just as the entry in the beginning of the war in Afghanistan was largely bipartisan. So the decision in 2001 to go into Afghanistan to take out the Taliban, which had supported al-Qaeda, which had carried out the attacks, was pretty widely accepted. The US Congress passing the authorization for the use of military force in 2001. We have 100 senators, 435 members of Congress, the House of Representatives. Of those 535, one person voted against the authorization for the use of military force. So it was bipartisan. And given what we've seen in the last few years in American politics, it's somewhat refreshing almost that wait a minute, there are important issues on which Republicans and Democrats agree. And so that was certainly the case going into the war in Afghanistan, and it was also the case with the withdrawal. So, of course, President Biden was widely ridiculed and criticized, and perhaps, in many, to a certain large extent, rightfully so. The withdrawal seemed to be bungled, not well planned. The US was caught off guard, many mistakes there. But the decision, the strategic decision to end the war in Afghanistan was bipartisan. Of course, it was the Trump administration that had opened negotiations with the Taliban for a year or so, leading up to the agreement in Doha, Qatar in February of 2020. That was when the deal was reached with the Trump administration. And so then, of course, Biden wins the White House, and we have a transition to the Democratic administration, but the policy remained the same. Okay, the previous Republican administration made this deal with the Taliban, and the Democratic administration comes in and says, we're gonna essentially keep to that deal. We're gonna stick to that deal. So bipartisanship on the way in and also on the way out. Important about that deal, the agreement in February of 2020, it was essentially Well, it was essentially, we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone. So the United States said to the Taliban, no more attacks on American forces, no more attacks on American troops, and also, importantly, significantly, no more support or hosting of international, transnational terrorist organizations. So no repeat of 9/11. You're not going to work with Al-Qaeda again so that they can attack the US again. You're not going to work with ISIS maybe, or new iterations of radical terrorist organizations like that. So, and then the US got that promise from the Taliban. I'm not sure how trustworthy those fellas are, that if we can, oh yeah, they gave us their word, but, and then in exchange for, the US said, then we will pull our troops out. We'll leave you alone. All right. And so importantly, the deal was made, the negotiations were made between the US government and the Taliban. The Afghanistan government was not present. They were not included in the negotiations. They were not part of the deal. The Taliban considered the Afghan government to be illegitimate. They were puppets of the US. And so they wouldn't negotiate with them. They wouldn't talk to them. They said, okay, well, rather than negotiate with the puppets, we want to negotiate with the puppet masters, with the United States. So the Afghanistan government itself was sidelined from those negotiations and the agreement. And so, and that's important, I think, in terms of the credibility of the Afghan government. And that helps, I think, to explain the quickness of the fall of the Afghan government and how the Taliban was able to take power so swiftly in Afghanistan. This also is, it's an interesting point. The United States, in August of 2021, the US withdraws, and it's just, and the Taliban quickly takes power, surprising many of us. And it was just, widely described as a debacle, a disaster, a catastrophe. And the Biden administration had made, just this embarrassing, catastrophic disaster, right? And I want to push back on that narrative a bit. Many of us were surprised, the US government clearly was surprised by the quickness and the ease with which the Taliban took over and took over the entire country. And this was the disaster, this was the debacle. And my question is, did we want a long drawn out battle? Did we want bloody battle after bloody battle for towns and cities throughout Afghanistan as the Taliban attempted to retake power, right? The decision was made by the Trump administration and also by the Biden administration that essentially we're okay if the Taliban resumes power. That was the decision. We thought it would take maybe a while. We thought it might take months or years eventually till they were able to possibly regain control of the Afghan government, but instead it took days. And we were surprised by this. And this was the disaster? Meaning that it would have been better had the Taliban retaken power in, as I say, with bloody battle after bloody battle. And in fact, they were able to take power without much bloodshed. And so for, the war has ended in Afghanistan. The failed state is no longer a failed state in terms of there is a government that actually rules Afghanistan, that is in control of the territory. Unlike, say, Syria, or to a large extent, Iraq, where these governments don't control their territory. And so this is what it had allowed Islamic State to move in to areas of Iraq and Syria where the government didn't have control. So clearly the Taliban government fails in terms of providing services for the citizens, the economic situation. The economy is in free fall. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. So clearly the government has failed in that respect. But political scientists use the term failed state not to refer to a government that has not met their objectives and has failed in that way, but to refer to a government that doesn't actually rule, doesn't control the territory in its country. And so a failed state no longer. Part of the problem also with the Afghan war was the massive corruption that we saw by the US supported Afghan government. And it was really a perfect storm for corruption. You have a very, very poor country without democratic institutions in place. Right? And then the US comes in and pours in billions and billions of dollars into a very, very poor country without a healthy, stable, institutionalized democratic government in place. So it was, it's kind of a perfect recipe for corruption. And so certainly then we saw that corruption in Afghanistan. And so that helped in terms of the Taliban, as it was working to overturn the Afghan government. It was easier to convince regular folks to say, do you want this corrupt government? Or do you want a government that will root out corruption? And so politically or strategically, they had quite an advantage in that respect. Also, I want to highlight the role of Pakistan. Khalada Gall wrote a book, I think about 2014, entitled The Wrong Enemy. And it was about the US war in Afghanistan, the title, The Wrong Enemy. And she was actually suggesting that the real problem in that region is the Pakistani government. And elements within the Pakistani government, particularly the ISI, which is the Security Intelligence Service of Pakistan, essentially their CIA. And the intelligence services Pakistan were largely responsible for the creation of the Taliban. And so during the war, the US-led war, the Taliban, after they were removed from power, had a safe haven, had a sanctuary in Pakistan, particularly in the tribal areas near the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So this made it difficult. And the US was in a bind because we needed Pakistan. We needed their support, their assistance for transport, et cetera. But so we couldn't put too much pressure on Pakistan to say, hey, we know that elements of your government are actually helping the Taliban. You claim to be helping us, but the US needed the Pakistanis, so there was less leverage by the US to demand to the Pakistanis that you need to do more to help the United States in its effort to defeat the Taliban. And so Pakistan was playing a classic double game, right? And on the one side, kind of propping up, giving sanctuary, safe haven to the Taliban. On the other side, saying to the US, oh yes, we're your partners in fighting global terrorism. And so that was a strategic problem as well. Another strategic problem, or what went wrong, had to do with the US approach in Afghanistan. Casualties, US military casualties, make overseas wars less popular politically. We don't want to see US soldiers coming home in body bags or in coffins draped in American flags. So there was a very strong effort to minimize US casualties in the effort in Afghanistan, which is a good thing. However, from a strategic point of view, it tended to not be so effective in that US soldiers kept to the bases. They stayed within the wire, as they say. So they weren't out in the neighborhoods. They weren't out in the villages. They weren't interacting and getting to know Afghanistans and understanding the culture and making friendships and making connections. They were somewhat distant and stayed on the bases in an effort to try to reduce the risk to those military personnel, to reduce the likelihood of casualties. However, from a strategic point of view, it pushed Afghans, civilians, away from the US and kind of reinforced the Taliban's argument, which is that these are colonial invaders, the US. They're not for us. They want to rule us. They're outsiders. They're imperialists, and they want to control Afghanistan. They want to take over. And so the strategy of trying to minimize casualties actually kind of worked to the Taliban's favor in that sense. And so, and of course, the national identity of Afghanistan is largely built upon a resistance to colonial invaders, colonial empires. So, Afghanistan is often referred to as the graveyard of empires, where empires go to die. So in the 19th century, it was the British that were unsuccessful in Afghanistan, as eventually withdrew in a humiliating way. In the 20th century, it was the Soviet Empire that had invaded and eventually had to withdraw in humiliating fashion. They did not accomplish their goals. And in the 21st century, then the US takes its turn. Oh, but we're different. Right? We are not like those other imperial powers. We are bringing democracy and we are bringing freedom. We are not trying to dominate or bring a colonial country under our control. And we, of course, then left in a similar fashion, right? Not accomplishing the goals and leaving after in a humiliating, somewhat humiliating way. So the current situation in Afghanistan, and President Biden, when he was justifying the withdrawal, asked Americans, had we been attacked on 9/11 by a transnational terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, had they organized and executed the attacks from, say, Yemen, rather than Afghanistan, would we be in Afghanistan? Right? And I think the clear answer is no. Right? Our interest in Afghanistan was to go after the terrorists, to go after Al-Qaeda. And so he was suggesting that we don't have a vital national interest in Afghanistan. Of course, the question is of responsibility. So the US bails on the Afghans, and now the Afghan economy is in free fall, and we face a humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of millions of people are facing starvation in the country. And so the US, the question of what kind of responsibility does the United States have? The Taliban, we don't want to support the Taliban. That's a terrorist, officially, according to the US government, is a terrorist organization itself, the Taliban. So it's illegal, according to US law, for the US to give assistance or give aid or support the Taliban. Right? So how does the US try to alleviate the humanitarian disaster that we see in Afghanistan, but we don't want to prop up or support in any way the Taliban government? So it's a difficult situation that we're currently in. And so in terms of the economics, I want to highlight a few things that the US has done. So 75, before the US pulled out, 75% of the Afghan government's budget was from foreign aid, and most of that from the United States. So we have a hugely aid-dependent country in Afghanistan. Something like 40% of the GDP of the Afghan economy was due to foreign aid. Right? So the US decides to pull out, Taliban takes over, and all that aid is cut off. No more official government assistance to the government of Afghanistan because it is now controlled by the Taliban. And so that's a huge problem. Secondly, we see that the US has implemented sanctions, much like we have sanctions against North Korea or Russia, right? These economic sanctions to limit trade and limit other economic relationships with the Afghan government. So that also contributes to the humanitarian disaster with those sanctions. It's difficult to see economic recovery in Afghanistan. Where is it going to come from? How is it going to happen? And then a third thing, so the withdrawal of aid after creating an aid-dependent country. And then we have economic sanctions, which prevent or limit the ability to grow economically or to expand the economy. And then thirdly, an important decision made recently by the Biden administration was to freeze $7 billion of foreign currency reserves of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, like countries around the world, have set aside foreign currency reserves in case there's an emergency. They can prop up their local currency. So the $7 billion of foreign currency reserves were held by the US financial system. So the US froze it, and President Biden has announced that we're going to split that $7 billion in half, and half of it is going to be designated for assistance to Afghanistan, humanitarian assistance, but not to the government itself, perhaps through humanitarian organizations, NGOs, et cetera. And then the other half of that $7 billion, which the US has seized, is designated to support families of the victims of 9/11. So from the Taliban's perspective, and from the perspective of many Afghans, even the anti-Taliban Afghans would say, that money is ours. That's Afghanistan's money. And you stole it from us, the United States. And you stole it from us at a time when we're desperate. Half the population is starving. And so this is a highly controversial decision by the Biden administration. Some critics have called it, in essence, it's a policy of mass murder. That we know that millions of people are going to suffer due to that, that decision. I'm not so sure if I would describe it that way, as a policy of mass murder, but it certainly is going to be murderous to the Afghan financial system, right? So there's been some talk that $3.5 billion that's been designated for Afghanistan, that should actually go to the central bank of Afghanistan. We remember the financial crisis of 2008, and when you have a financial system which is in crisis, which is frozen, which is not operable, then the entire economy then is in bad shape. And so that's what we see in Afghanistan. The financial system, the financial sector from the central bank on down is relatively non-existent. And so this makes it almost impossible to think about economic growth or economic recovery in Afghanistan without a viable financial system there. So there's some obligation perhaps from the United States. And then also, importantly, and a fourth factor, so those are three important factors where the U.S. is maybe not responsible, but the actions taken by the United States have made the economic situation in Afghanistan dire. The withdrawal of aid, the sanctions, and then the freezing of the foreign currency reserves. And then a fourth thing is the withdrawal has badly damaged the services sector in Afghanistan. So during the 20-year war, we had U.S. military personnel, of course, but diplomats, aid organizations, consultants. I've been one of those working for World Vision in poor countries. And so my experience, in Mozambique doing this kind of work, I stayed in a really nice hotel, right? I ate lunch and dinner and at restaurants, and I utilized the services sector, whether it was the hotel, the food, the taxi drivers, et cetera. And so this services sector, that part of the economy of Afghanistan has essentially been undercut by the withdrawal of the United States, and then the withdrawal of all of those consultants and aid organizations and U.S. military personnel and diplomats, not just from the U.S., but from around the world then, who have left. So the economic situation in Afghanistan is dire. And so this raises, though, the question again about economic tools of statecraft. We have sanctions on Iran. We have sanctions on North Korea. Where our problem, our disagreement is with the governments. It's not that we want North Koreans to suffer. They're poor. They're facing food insecurity. That's not the goal. The goal is not to create and worsen a humanitarian crisis. The goal is to put pressure on the government. And so we have that situation in Afghanistan. We don't want to help the Taliban. We don't want to prop up the Taliban. We don't want to help them. So what does that mean? Does that mean then that we keep these economic sanctions in place, that we deny aid and economic assistance to the government, when in fact the people of Afghanistan will pay the price? So I'm going to leave it at that for now. I have lots of other points to make or things to say, but I'm sure that you all have important insights and questions and thoughts to share. And let's open it up if we can, please, Jen.
Are there questions here? Are there questions here?
You've talked about different organizations. What is ISIS or ISIL?
Okay, thank you. The question is, what is ISIS or ISIL? Islamic State. So Islamic State is a terrorist organization, a transnational terrorist organization that developed after the attacks of 9/11. So it's, to some extent, it's Al-Qaeda 2.0. It's a different iteration. The major distinction, ideologically, they're on the same page, right? Radical Islamist, not Islamic, radical Islamist terrorists. So ideologically, very much the same, have similar political goals and agenda, except for that Islamic State had decided that they were ready to actually create a state, to have a territory, to try to create a caliphate, to actually have a government. Osama bin Laden, as the leader of Al-Qaeda, said, no, that's not our strategy. We're not ready for that. We want to be a loose network where they can't find us. We can attack the United States and then retreat to a cave or hide in a city in Pakistan. And so the US wants to respond, but they can't find us. Right? They don't know where Al-Qaeda is necessarily. And Islamic State then decided, no, we think we're ready. And especially with the failed states, as I had mentioned before, in Iraq and in Syria, this created the perfect opportunity then for Islamic State to say, oh, we're going to seize this territory and we're going to actually try to be legitimate, like not just a terrorist network that's attacking and then retreating, but actually a government. We're going to be a ruling power. We're going to have territory, and we're going to have a government and a state, Islamic state. And so there are all kinds of offshoots, right? So we had, there's so-called ISIS K in Pakistan. And this was the organization that was responsible for the suicide bombing at the airport in August of 2021, when the US was withdrawing, and 100, 200 some Afghanistan civilians were killed. 13 US military personnel were killed. And so these folks, the ISIS, they're ideologically compatible with the Taliban, but the Taliban did not want that attack. All right, so ISIS and the Taliban are essentially the bad guys who are aligned ideologically, but are competing with each other for political power. And yeah, that terrorist attack led to the last bombing of the US campaign in Afghanistan after 20 years of war. The US, I mean, it's somewhat, for me, it's tragic, and it's symbolic of the 20-year failure of the United States in Afghanistan. The drone attack trying to find the ISIS-K murderers, terrorists who had executed and planned that suicide bombing at the airport. We're going to find them. We're going to go after them. The US had intelligence that, oh, there's this vehicle. We think it's another terrorist attack. This is ISIS-K. So we're going to order in a drone strike to take out this vehicle to prevent another suicide bombing like the one we had seen. And so the attack, the US drone strike took place. 10 people were killed. 7 of them were children. And we realized afterwards, oops, we got it wrong. You know, they weren't terrorists. It was an aid worker and his family. And 7 children were among the 10 dead. And so to me, this, you know, like I said, somewhat symbolizes or encapsulates kind of the tragedy of 20 years in the last salvo, the last bombing run, the last military effort in Afghanistan was ill-fated, as the entire project in Afghanistan seems to have been ill-fated.
One thing that I think is in the forefront, or has gotten a lot of publicity for Americans and has us with feelings of sympathy, is the treatment of women and the fact that things had improved for them, and now everything allegedly going backwards. A problem in Afghanistan, but then throughout the Middle East. And it's a horrible situation for us to witness, but what role can the United States truly play? We can't be the police from a military or even a human rights situation, especially if some of these practices are based in the local religions. And how can Americans kind of deal with this fact that, no, we can't change the world in every way?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point and great question. That when it comes to the ill treatment of women and girls, certainly the Taliban, you know, they have a horrendous record in that regard. So too, as you mentioned, many places in the region, Saudi Arabia as one example. There's a question about the Taliban, you know, it's like this Taliban, it seemed, you know, they claim to be kinder and gentler. right? The previous Taliban, when they ruled in from 96 to 2001, they were awful. They were horrific, right? But this Taliban, we've changed our stripes. We're kinder and gentler. We're going to allow for the education of girls, and we're going to allow for, for minority rights and et cetera. And it is still, the jury is still out on that, in that regard. The Taliban has allowed for elementary age girls to be educated, but has restricted education beyond, for the high school level and beyond. Then the Taliban obviously is in desperate need of assistance. No, as far as I know, checking last night, no government has offered official diplomatic recognition of the Taliban government as being the legitimate government. So the international community, even Pakistan, has not officially recognized the Taliban government. So in order for any IMF assistance or World Bank assistance or anything like that, that would require this official diplomatic recognition of the Taliban. And so in order to achieve that, the Taliban has is trying to say to the international community, hey, we're not so bad, right? We do respect human rights. We will allow the education of girls in the society. We will give rights to women in order to try to gain that diplomatic recognition, which would then allow them to receive economic assistance. So yeah, I mean, for the United States, there's a concern, it's an interest. The US, of course, supports human rights, supports empowerment of women and girls, but it's an issue, it's an interest of the United States, but it is not a vital interest. And so President Biden had made that clear that yes, it's important, but it's an interest, but it's not a vital interest. It's not worth fighting a war for. It's not worth sending US military personnel to put them in harm's way to try to advance this interest. And so that's yeah, it's a difficult question. This was not necessarily your question, but it's important, I think, or interesting, is the era of nation building or state building or democracy promotion, is the era of nation building over for the United States? Have we turned a corner and said, okay, trying to impose democracy or trying to impose regime change or trying to take over a country and build up a new government, a democratic government, perhaps in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, we realize maybe that doesn't work. We're done with that. We're not going to do that anymore. That seems to be the argument of the Biden administration, talking about vital interests, and meaning interests that are so important to the United States, so crucial, essential, that we're willing to use military force, we're willing to go to war, we're willing to send US soldiers into harm's way to advance vital interests. And there are other interests, human rights, education, humanitarian interests, that are interests, but not vital interests. We're not going to go to war for those things. And again, it seems to be somewhat bipartisan. There are hawks, on both sides of the aisle, more so perhaps on the Republican side, the Lindsey Graham types, right? Who Lindsey says, we'll be back in Afghanistan. Like the same thing is going to happen, right? This Taliban government, they haven't changed. They're going to support terrorists, and we'll be back in Afghanistan. So there are these hawks who support the use of military force and continued use of military force in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But for the most part, it's bipartisan. President Trump, he ran largely on his campaign largely about ending endless wars, right? We don't want to be doing this type of thing, right? He was highly critical of George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq. He says, we got to get out of these endless wars. And then President Biden comes into office, yes, major, they disagree on a lot of stuff, but on that, they're essentially in agreement. There's essential widespread, it seems to me, bipartisanship on the idea of moving beyond using military force for humanitarian or nation building exercises.
Professor, you have a few questions in the chat, and I'd be happy to read them, but because you're a skilled presenter and well, you're used to interacting with your students, do you want to go ahead and read
Sure,
them
yeah,
and kind of
so,
choose?
Will you comment on the status of women before and after our withdrawal? I think we kind of addressed that just now. And I just want to reiterate, right, that before Afghanistan is a very, very poor country. It was a very, very poor country before the United States got involved. The status of women and girls was not good before the United States came in. So there's not a lot that has changed in terms of the big picture. What should the U.S. have done between 88 and 96? That could have resulted in a better outcome. The Taliban's reign of terror doesn't ever start. Yeah, this is this notion that the U.S. would decide who would rule Afghanistan. The decision was made in 88, 89. The Cold War is over. Yeah, we don't like the Taliban. They're bad guys. They commit human rights abuses, but there are a lot of bad governments around the world. There are a lot of governments that commit human rights abuses around the world. And the decision was made to not be determinative and essentially allow the Taliban to take power. And so this is a problem or a crisis or a question, not just in Afghanistan, but worldwide. The United States has 20-some thousand troops in South Korea. We have troops in Germany. We have military bases and troops in Japan. My point is that when the U.S. fights wars, usually we don't leave. Right? It's not that, okay, now the war's over, we're going to bring all our troops home. The troops and the bases stay. In the case of Vietnam, in the case of Iraq, in the case of Afghanistan, the war has ended and the troops have also left. So are we suggesting that the U.S. should have troops in Afghanistan in perpetuity? We're just going to be there and essentially, be the imperial power to make sure that Afghanistan is ruled by the people who are preferred by the United States, or what we've seen is a decision to not make that effort. And the U.S. public, I want to say this, I think is an important part of it as well. There's no appetite in the United States among the public, right, to say, hey, let's keep troops in Afghanistan. Let's send the troops back to Afghanistan. Let's incur potentially heavy losses to prop up the government that we prefer in Afghanistan or anywhere in the world. So I think this helps explain the bipartisanship of the withdrawal, right? No one is running for office saying, vote for me, I'll send the troops back to Afghanistan, right? Even if it would help from a humanitarian point of view. What should the U.S., my ideas about what should the U.S. do to assist the humanitarian crisis? I think, yeah, it's a difficult, painful, it's a terrible, awful decision, because if we want to effectively address the humanitarian crisis, we need to recognize and deal with the Taliban. And so that is a difficult one, right? But I think that's going to be the bitter pill we'll have to swallow.
Are the Taliban allowing any Western NGOs into the country? And if so, what type? And
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the UN does not have any plans at this point.
From what I've read, and obviously not on the ground, but from what I've read, yes, that the wiser, calmer heads have prevailed in Afghanistan, insisting to the Taliban, you have to leave these NGOs alone. During the US occupation, of course, the Taliban would target Western aid organizations, and with bombings, with military attacks, going after them, trying to undercut them. And from my understanding now, that has largely stopped, that they're allowing these Western humanitarian aid organizations to continue to do their work, and they've left them alone. And I think that may be part of their strategy to try to achieve diplomatic recognition and acceptance diplomatically, to say, all right, we're not terrorists, we're a legitimate government, and we're not going after aid organizations, we're not going after those charity groups. The United Nations did put out an appeal to the member states asking for $4.5 billion. They have asked for. This is the largest appeal that the United Nations has made in its history. And so the pledges have not been coming, and it's the difficulty. How do you bypass the Taliban? We don't want to support the Taliban. We want to support the Afghan people. And as I said, it's a conundrum, to say the least. But yeah, from my understanding, the aid organizations are not being attacked by the Taliban. They're able to work.
I have a question. Hello?
Hello, yes.
Yep. You made reference to the fact that sanctions often fall down to the population rather than just the governments. Isn't that really the intention of sanctions? That it'll ultimately fall to the people, and the result will be, at some point, the pressure on the government from their own people will be so great that they may have to alter those objectionable policies. I'm thinking of the ruble fall in Russia right now.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And some would say that's the problem with sanctions, that strategically it's mangled. It's not clear. What are we trying to accomplish here? The sanctions, I was reading an article last night about proposed sanctions against Russia that are actually designed to go after the oligarchs and go after the families of the oligarchs, instead of trying to do more broad-based sanctions that would hurt the broader population. The idea, yeah, that if you create significant economic pain on the population, then the population will then put pressure on the government. This is seemingly the hope in Iran, right? That the Iranian people will say to the government, hey, all right, we don't need nuclear weapons. We need jobs, we need food, we need economic opportunity. So put away the nuclear weapons program. And so we're not sure. The problem, as I see it, is that when demands are made of governments to reform, to democratize, to open up, to liberalize, to respect human rights, to respect democratic institutions, when those demands are made by a population, they're usually worldwide and through history, they're usually made by the middle class. So populations that are impoverished, people who are desperately poor, rarely exert political pressure on governments. It's usually the middle classes that are able to exert political pressure on their governments. Whether we saw that during the Arab Spring, we've seen that recently in Belarus. Previous to that, we saw it in 2014 in Ukraine. So the idea that you're going to impoverish a people and put them in severe abject poverty and then expect them to rise up and put pressure on a government, that seems to be, that doesn't make too much sense from my perspective.
As you mentioned, both parties or both presidential candidates said that they wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And as I understand it, former President Trump said that I want to set a date of the 3rd of January to get out of Afghanistan. I'm just wondering, if Trump had become president, what would have been done differently on that day that they pulled out?
Yeah, I don't know. This is interesting, right? And by the way, too, it preceded President Trump. I mean, President Obama in 2008, he ran on, we got to get out,
Yeah.
right? We got to get out of Iraq. We got to get out of Afghanistan. And then that message was continued with President Trump, and that message, of course, was continued and then carried out with President Biden. Yet during the summer of 2021, President Trump, now he's of course highly critical of Biden and highly critical of the way the withdrawal had occurred. In the summer of 2021, he was offering a little different criticism. He was saying that Biden is going to take credit for the withdrawal. And he said, wait a minute, I did the withdrawal. Like, I reached the agreement. I signed the deal in February. It was my doing. And now Biden's going to come in at the last minute
Steal
and
his
take
thunder.
credit for the withdrawal. So, and then of course, as the withdrawal was so disastrous or so bungled, then President Trump, former President Trump, then switched to criticism.
I
to
always
say
wonder
that
what
we
would
should-
have been different if he had been.
I don't
president.
know. Yeah, this is a counterfactual. My perspective, my guess would be not much. I think, yeah, I mean, President Trump was pretty clear. We need to end these endless wars.
Yeah.
We need to bring the troops home.
He even set a date.
Yeah, it's even set a date, and then President Biden extended that date, but also a very similar strategic calculus, it
Yeah.
seems to me. Not a great difference,
Mhm.
right? So in terms of international organizations, say, where Trump was very much for preserving U.S. independence, U.S. sovereignty, not wanting to give that up to international organizations, international law, et cetera. And that is a big difference between Biden and Trump in terms of foreign policy. But as regards to getting us out of Afghanistan, yeah, they're, from my perspective, on the same page. So I don't think much would have been different in that respect.
And Trump would have been pilloried.
Oh, of course.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's politics. Right? Yes.
The next question I think is interesting as of today. Could you see a similar situation developing in Ukraine?
Yeah, the question, a similar situation possibly in Ukraine. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. It was before the attacks of 9/11. It still is. Ukraine is a European country, has a different, level, has economic development. It doesn't face the same humanitarian catastrophes that we see in Afghanistan. But certainly we're seeing, I saw images this morning of the traffic jams, folks trying to leave Kiev. So we have this immigration crisis, perhaps. Where are these folks going? That in that way, there's perhaps some similarity. By the way, in terms of Afghanistan, some estimates, of course, vary, but some 3 million people have fled since the Taliban has taken power. And the problem with that is that who is fleeing Afghanistan? Anybody who can afford it, right? If you have resources, if you have means, then you're getting out of there. And then in terms of the economic health or redevelopment growth of Afghanistan, those folks who would be mostly responsible for the economic growth and development, those folks are gone, right? And so the situation in Ukraine is a disaster. Putin is a despot. He's an aggressor. He's awful. He's killing people. But the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is just a whole different category of humanitarian crisis that we see in Ukraine.
I had a question on, I've heard it said that we could have left 2,500 troops and the 2,500 troops could have helped with air support and at least protected that Kabul area for a more orderly withdrawal and maybe getting more American citizens and people who help the American government out. Does that make sense to you that could have been done?
Yeah, that's we've heard that you put it very well, that argument. Just keep a residual force. We don't need to have 100,000 troops, but minimal, and just be there to prevent the Taliban essentially from taking power. The Biden administration claims that that was not a feasible option because the Taliban had agreed in February of 2020 in Doha to leave us alone. And they had, but if the US had signaled its intention to stay, to say, we're not going to withdraw, we're going to keep 2,500 troops, we're going to keep this residual force, then the attacks by the Taliban on the US military would have restarted. So the Taliban paused their attacks against the United States, against US forces during that period, and to try to encourage the US to leave by saying, we're not going to attack you. And the idea, at least the claim by the Biden administration, was that it was not an option to leave these minimal forces, because had we declared we're going to stay, then the Taliban would have resumed their attacks and stepped up their attacks onto US military personnel, which would then have required the US to send more troops in to, in essence, protect the troops, the minimal troops that were there. So it was either, President Biden has said, it was either we withdraw or we have to send more troops. That was the option. And that this idea that we could keep this small residual force really wasn't a viable option, because the Taliban would have resumed its attacks against US forces there.
Sorry, firstly, a very, very good discussion today. You mentioned state building. And one of the themes of today is what lessons are to be learned from the withdrawal. State building and bringing democracy is indeed a worthy goal. Perhaps a mistake we make is the type of state and the type of democracy we want to bring to these countries far, far, far away, with different cultures, different tribal traditions, different histories. So we want to bring them a state in the mirror image of Connecticut, with equivalent women rights, equivalent gay rights, equivalent every rights. And effectively, we always find people locally who agree with that. They are often called collaborators. So I believe the mistake we're making, and will continue to make, is we're trying to bring to a country that is still, to a certain extent, like Saudi Arabia in the 1910s and 1920s, like the US was, into being the US of the 2022. And that causes average, ordinary, good people in Afghanistan, not the Taliban, not the crazies, average, good people who remember that in 1840, this superpower was the British Empire. And in 1840, on January the 1st, in a snowstorm, 4,500 British troops, 20,000 camp followers, a lot of collaborators, went out in the snow, and the history says one person, Dr. William Bryden, survived. That is their Alamo. They have that. So mistake we made it also in Vietnam, is we want to bring to these countries the democracy, the norms of the New York Times today, and it's out of phase. And they will always resist that. Occupiers will always be resisted. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, that was excellent. Thank you for making that case. A recent book by political scientist Stephen Krasner is called How to Make Love to a Despot. And in this book, Krasner says, much like the statement, that our goals are too ambitious. Instead of trying to put in place Western style democracies or Connecticut style democracy, instead of that, we should be going for good enough governance. And if there's a despot, yeah, maybe that's not our first choice, but there's a government and it's good enough, and it doesn't need to be Connecticut. And that we should put away those illusions that we can, affect this type of change. And I would say, yes, that the idea of collaborators, this is a recurring theme, it seems to me, in US foreign policy, that we underestimate the nationalism that, from my perspective, naturally emerges when there is any kind of occupation, right? That there's a natural resistance to that. And it's easy for the resistors to make this argument, whether, it's Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam to say they're the imperialists. And we're saying, no, we're not the imperialists. we want to support Vietnam. And the same thing in Afghanistan, where the Taliban saying they're the occupiers, they're the foreign invaders, they're the imperial powers, they're the occupiers. And we're saying, no, we actually want to support you. And it seems to me that the US is somewhat myopic about that in terms of, we have a definition or understanding of ourselves that is not shared around the world. And and it seems pretty obvious, like, would the United States, how would we, respond? How would most Americans respond if, say, the Chinese invaded and occupied and took over and said, oh no, we're doing it for your own good? I think I would, resist that notion. So yeah, there seems to be a disconnect there, and perhaps, we should put aside those grandiose ambitions and dreams. George W. Bush said, mark my words, Afghanistan and Iraq will be democracies, and they will lead this area of the world on the democratic path. And yeah, wishful thinking at best.
There is another question in the chat that I'd like to bring to your attention. What about the humanitarian crisis of the remaining Afghans who had ties to the Americans and were unable to get on any of the planes in the final hours of our withdrawal? We seem to have no coordinated pathways to address their peril.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's no good way to end a war. There's no good way to lose a war. All right, so the decision was made, we're out. And yeah, there's going to be pain. There's going to be humanitarian suffering. There's going to be people Afghans who supported the US, who worked side by side with the US, who are left behind. And it's a disaster. It's terrible. But there's no, like I said, there's no good way to end a war. There's no good way to lose a war. Many of the folks, this is not necessarily the question, but a point I wanted to make. Many of the Afghans who were left behind or who the US abandoned were interpreters. Thousands and thousands and thousands of interpreters. The US was there for 20 years. We didn't learn the language? Right? We're the smartest people on the planet, or we have the best educational systems. We have all the resources. 20 years. So the people we're sending over there, many of them weren't even born yet at 9/11. They could have been learning the language for decades, and then we wouldn't need to rely on these interpreters. So I think that's just it's a small point, but it's symbolic, right, of this idea that we are going into a country we know very little about. We don't know what a Pashtun is, what a Tajik is. We don't know the language. We don't know the customs. We don't know the cultures, but we do know that they ought to be more like Connecticut, that they ought to embrace democracy. And it seems to be part of the hubris of the failed effort there.
I have a question. Rather than the chat, the role of ISIS, from one military person's viewpoint, the chaos in the withdrawal was really a function of ISIS, and you have referred to that in terms of the bombing, but and I wonder, because this person would say that the continuing chaos, a lot of it that is the Taliban looking over its shoulder at ISIS and their role. Can you comment about that?
Yes, we touched on this a little bit before, but yes, ISIS-K, which is the local version of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, Pakistan area, they're ideologically allies with the Taliban, but politically they're in a competition for power. So yeah, the Taliban wants to prevent attacks like we saw at the Kabul airport. They want to get rid of ISIS-K. They don't see them as collaborators. They see them as rivals, but they're ideologically on the same page, but politically in terms of competing for the power. I think, that ISIS-K wishes that they were the Taliban. Also, Pakistan, we've seen an uptick in terrorist violence in Pakistan as well. So Pakistan is, some would say, maybe reaping what they sowed in terms of the Taliban's return for power, that the Pakistani Taliban now is carrying out terrorist attacks in Pakistan and then using Afghanistan now as their safe haven, as their sanctuary to avoid Pakistani government reprisals.
Yes, can I break in here from the classroom? My reading of what happened at the end, Joel, is that the Taliban, during that whole period of we wanted to conclude things, became much closer to all the people in the country. And they succeeded in painting us as the outsider, the occupier, the one who was responsible for the killing of the people. We don't want to kill you. We are native born. We are your brothers and sisters. And wouldn't you prefer to have, even though you may be opposed to us, wouldn't you prefer to have us than these outsider occupiers who've been responsible for killing so many of our people in wanting to take control here? And isn't the way forward for the United States to be seen as in the trenches with the people, caring for them, their food, their economy, their jobs, instead of we are going to control who the government is? Maybe we need to work with the Taliban and work for an alleviation of the humanitarian crisis that's wreaking that country.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Yeah, we made it too easy, maybe, for the Taliban to gain support. And the US was surprised. I mean, the idea that the notion that the US was taken aback, that we were shocked by how quickly the Taliban had gained power and taken over village after village and province after province, shows that we did not understand the average Afghan point of view or perspective, that we thought that they were opposed to the Taliban. Also, I think you made the point very well. So I want to add a little bit to it, that the United States all this time, in terms of the hubris and being, somewhat delusional about how things were going, for 20 years, I paid fairly close attention. And for 20 years, we were told we're winning. We're accomplishing our goals. We're getting there, right? We're making progress. That's what the military leaders, that's what the consecutive presidents told us, right? Yeah, it's difficult, but we're making progress. We're achieving our objectives. We're getting there. And that just wasn't true, right? We were losing and nobody told us, right? We were not being successful. The Taliban was regrouping. The Taliban was gaining power over the years and years and years. And the American people, we were told, nope, everything's good. We're accomplishing our goals. We're getting there. We just need to see it through to the end. And then finally that kind of myth or lie that we told ourselves then was no longer tenable. Eventually, kind of the rug got pulled out from under that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Joel, for an excellent presentation. Please give him a warm thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you for everybody at home as well. And I'll go ahead and close the class.
Thank you.
How can America
Thank you.
think that they would be like us when
Taliban happen to be people of their own people.